Finding a percentage of an amount is a tricky one because there are different methods that you can use and even more methods, bearing in mind that there's normally a different way you'd work it out depending on whether it's a calculator or a non-calculator paper. So I'm going to try and break some of those down. So a non-calculator question, typically the percentage that you're going to be looking for is going to be a nicer percentage, something like 35%. Let's do that as an example. Let's find 35% of 250. Now there are certain nice percentages that you can find quite easily, such as 10%. To find 10%, you take your original number and divide it by 10, because your original number is 100%, and if you divide that by 10, you're left with 10%. So 10% of our original number would be 25. In a different question, it might also be useful to find 50%, which is a nice easy one as well, because you can just half your original number. Because 50% is the same as a half. So half of 250 is 125. There are other nice percentages too. We could find 5% quite nicely, either by taking 10% and halving it, because half of 10% is 5%. So we could take this number and divide that by 2, and half of 25 is 12.5. Or instead of taking 10% and halving it, we could have taken 50% and divided that by 10. Because 50 divided by 10 is 5%, and you'll notice that that divided by 10 is also 12.5. Now that's all very good, but we are looking for 35%, not 10 or 50 or 5. So to get to 35%, we can use some of these percentages we've found. We could do it in a few different ways. We could take 10%, times it by 3, because then we'll be at 30%, and then add on 5. Or, for example, we could just take 5% and times that by 7, because 5 times 7 is 35. But you can see that doing 12.5 times 7 is going to be a tricky one. So I'm going to do it that first way I said. I'm going to take 10% and times that by 3, and then I'm going to add on 5%. And that is going to give us the 35% that we require. So the 10% was 25. Let's take our 25 and times that by 3, which is 75. And we then add on our 5%, which was 12.5. And 75 plus 12.5 is 87.5. So that is 35% of 250. Now, if you were doing a question like that on a calculator, let's take the same question. Let's take 35% of 250. If I was doing that on a calculator, we can do it much more quickly, but the maths is harder if we use a different method. So if you have a calculator, you can always find a percentage in just 2 simple steps. You take your number that you're looking at, for us it's 250, and divide it by 100. Now, you could tap away into a calculator, and what your calculator would give you is 2.5. Now, the reason why we do that, that's our first step, and the reason why we take that first step is because when we divide by 100, we're finding 1% of our original number. And if 2.5 is what 1% is, then I can just take what 1% is and times it by how many percent I need. So times it by the percentage. And again, you just put it in your calculator, 2.5 times by 35 gives you 87.5. 87.5, which thankfully is the same answer as we got without a calculator. And you can see how easy, or how this wasn't many steps, it was just 2 steps to work out this percentage. But if we had tried to do this without a calculator, 2.5 times 35, that's tricky. So that's why there are 2 methods, whether you do or don't have a calculator. If it's non-calculator, you typically want to start by breaking it down into maybe 10% first, maybe 5% after that, and trying to work out how you can build up to 35%. Whereas if you do have a calculator, you don't have to worry about that. You can just divide by 100 to get 1%, times that by how many percent you need. And in fact, I will just write down those 2 steps. So step 1 was divide by 100, and step 2 was times by the percent you need. That's the rule for if it's a calculator paper. So there are 4 questions for you there. I've got a couple on the left-hand side which are designed to be non-calculator, and a couple on the right-hand side where I prefer you to try and use a calculator. If you like, you can pause the video here and have a go at them before I talk through. So I'll just give you a second to pause if you would like to, and then I'll talk through the answers. All right, let's talk through. So 20% of 150, non-calculator. Well, the good starting point is always to find 10%, which we know we get by doing our original number divided by 10, which is 15. And straight away, we can see that we can get to 20% by just doubling 10%. So I'm going to take my 15, which is what 10% is, and times it by 2. We're looking for 20%. We know what 10% is. 20% is twice as much, so I find twice as much, and it's 30. So 20% of 150 is 30. 45% is going to be a bit trickier. It's going to take a few more steps, but that's okay. We'll start by finding 10% again. 10% we divide by 10. 80 divided by 10 is 8. So that's what 10% is. Now I'm going to find 5% next. And because 5% is half of 10%, I just half 10% to get 4. And now I'm looking, I think I've got a way of building up to 45. I'm just going to do 10%, 10%, 10%, 10%. That'll be 40, and then add on the 5% afterwards. So I need 4 lots of the 10%. That's 4 times 8, which is 32. And reminder, that is what 40% is. I know that 5% is 4, so I'm going to add those together to get 36. That is 45%. Now, if we look at the ones where you're intended to use a calculator, we just take those 2 steps that we did before and just do them in new numbers. So we'll take 220 and divide it by 100 to get what 1% is. If you put that in the calculator, it comes to 2.2. We've divided by 100, so we now take that number and multiply by how many percent we need. And I actually am going to have to do that on the calculator. 26.4. So the 2.2 was our 1%. We didn't want 1%, we wanted 12%, so we needed 12 of them, which is 26.4. Same again with the 51%. We're going to take our 20, divide it by 100, which on the calculator would come to 0.2. And that's what 1% is. We want 51%, so we take our 0.2, times it by 51, and 0.2 times 51 is 10.2. That is 51% of 20. So 2 different methods, one for if you don't have a calculator, one for if you do have a calculator. I also just want to point out that this is not the only way of doing it with a calculator. You can do it in different ways. And similarly, we could have worked out any of these non-calculator questions in a handful of different ways as well. So these aren't the only ways, but if you did try these, as long as you got the right answers, the same answers that I got, then you must be doing something right. Thank you.